A group of friends was staying at this remote cabin that one of them owned. There were no roads leading to the cabin, and it was almost a whole day's hike from where you park the cars. I couldn't go at the same time as everyone else due to work, so I decided to head up the same day, but later. It would mean I would have to camp for a night by myself, though. The latter part of the trail is too dangerous to be taken at night, especially by someone who doesn't know it. I didn't care much. I was kind of looking forward to it, as I've never camped alone before. So I was in the middle of these woods when the sun went down. I got my camp set up in this small clearing, probably 40 feet across. I get my campfire going and pitch my small one-person tent. Then I do all that camping stuff like cooking hot dogs on a stick over the fire and s'mores. I probably stay up for a good 2 or 3 hours after dark. It was mid-autumn, so the days were somewhat short. The entire time, I thought I heard something moving in the woods on the edge of the clearing. I didn't think anything of it at first, cause the woods are full of animals, but as the night went on, I realized that whatever it was just circling the clearing over and over. Once I started paying attention, it made 4 or 5 laps around before I decided to get up and investigate. The noise stopped as soon as I stood up, and I thought I heard some sound going away through the woods. I just shrugged it off, thinking it was some fox that was curious, and got scared when I stood up. I decided it was time to sleep, doused the fire, and climbed into my tent. I started to doze off and stayed in that half-asleep state for a while. I normally hear weird shit when I'm in this state, so I didn't think much of it when I heard a voice. Something woke me all the way up, though, and I realized the voice was real and right outside my tent. It was just above a whisper, and I'm not sure if it was another language or if they were just speaking English in such a manner that I couldn't understand. I lay there for some time, I don't know how long, listening and waiting for something to happen. There was just enough moonlight to light up the walls of the tent, so I could see when a hand pressed into the wall of my tent down near my foot. This freaked me out, and I sat up quickly. Whoever was outside of the tent tore ass out of there. They ran at a full sprint through the woods. I got out of the tent, shined my flashlight around, and saw nothing. I was expecting there to be a bloody handprint on the tent, but there was none. I didn't sleep that night. I packed up camp at first light that morning and booked it to the cabin. I have a bunch of woods behind my house, and when I was younger, my friend and I would go camping in them. We were like 14 years old. We went farther than we usually did one day and ended up coming out on a neighbor's property. So we just went back a little ways and started getting our things set up. My friend leaves to go use the bathroom, and I hear him screaming and running back toward me. He's not making much sense and was just sort of blubbering about Barbie and cat heads. I sort of force him to show me. We come out in a clearing next to the creek, and there are dozens of Barbie dolls strung up in the trees about 8 feet off the ground. There were cat heads on them. The dolls' heads had been yanked off and replaced with them. They looked like the cats' skulls had been removed. I want to say the dolls' bodies were dipped in red paint, but I don't know for sure what it really was. I start backing up toward our stuff, and my friend starts screaming again. He's off to my side and had just discovered a huge pile of cat remains. A bunch of Barbie doll heads were thrown in with them. We both threw up. We packed our stuff up and went back home. But it doesn't end there. That neighbor whose field we stumbled into, they are family friends, and they recently told my mom about their barn cats going missing. However, they hadn't thought anything of it since we have a lot of coyotes in the area. I hadn't told my mom about our discovery in the woods yet because I figured she'd never let me leave the yard again. A week later, 2 of their goats went missing. A coyote wouldn't have opened the gate and shut it back after slaughtering their goats, and there'd be some kind of leftovers. The neighbor's husband heard someone walking around in their yard one night and saw some guy roaming around in their cow pasture. They sort of connected the pieces. Someone was stealing their animals, so the husband went into 24/7 armed security mode. Another week or so later, he sees the same guy go into his barn. He calls the cops. It turns out it's some 16-year-old kid that lived on the other side of his property that had just moved in. The kid admits to stealing his cats, goats, and trying to take a cow, but he could no longer return them. The kid lives in a mobile home. There's nowhere to keep all these animals he's been stealing. The kid's father ends up telling the cops that he knew his son was taking them and basically slaughtering them in the woods. His son would then do weird things with the bodies. About the Barbie dolls, he stole them from his little sister and other girls who lived nearby. It wasn't until a year or so after that my mum actually told me what had happened. That's when I gave in and told her about my friend, and I basically stumbling into the messed up cats and Barbie dolls. As far as I know, they got the kid for animal cruelty and a whole bunch of other things. His family moved away not too long after. I went camping in Big Sur, California, with one of my best friends. It was off-season and a Sunday night, so the place was practically empty. We picked a campsite about a half-mile walk to the ocean. It was in a huge open field surrounded by a lush forest. In the background were the limestone mountains, and you could hear the crashing of the ocean's waves. We spent the night around a campfire telling stories and eating. We're both pretty experienced backpackers too. We are very diligent in ensuring we do not leave any trace of food by our site, and almost everything other than our essentials goes in the bear bag. I have my dog with me too. She's a service dog, so she was allowed on the site. She's leashed around one of the few trees in the field on a long metal leash and full harness. It's a full moon out, and it was pouring beautiful blue light across the field. It was absolutely pristine and breathtaking. Around 1 a.m., something spooks my dog. Now, she is used to the woods and has an incredibly calm demeanor. But there she was, flipping out and tugging hard on the leash like she is desperate to escape. Then she pulls so hard that her harness snaps and she goes bolting across the field into the wilderness. I lost my cool. I drop everything and bolt after her. I'm not thinking straight running into the woods at night. My only concern was getting her, even if it meant risking my safety. I rescue her. I find her curled up in a random clearing in the woods, looking ashamed and terrified. Thank God she ran in a straight line, otherwise I would have been totally lost. I walk back, carrying her, and my heart is pounding furiously at the horror of the idea of her being lost in the wilderness forever. The thought now is still unbearable. I can feel her heart pounding too in my arms. She's still terrified. We all head to bed in my tent, but my dog won't lay down. Her ears are up and she's staring intensely at the tent wall as if she could see through it and she's tracking something. It takes a while for my nerves to calm down from my chase earlier. I'm working hard at taking deep breaths and reminding myself that I'm prepared for anything that I could encounter. Maybe my dog is simply spooked by a raccoon. Maybe she's just exhausted and acting up. And then I hear it. There was cackling outside. It's like a high-pitched laughter that sounds sinister, and it's coming from outside my tent. To hell with deep breathing. My senses go on high alert. My body tenses up so tightly, and it's like I'm about to break in half. I can't even breathe. And then I hear even more cackling, like a group of witches were doing something evil just yards away. It fills my hearing, laughing, and even more laughing. It's loud, and it just sounds so wrong. The laughs are then followed up with blood-curdling screams. It honestly sounded like somebody was being murdered, like someone panicking and screaming for dear life. It could have been wolves or coyotes killing their prey, but it sounded so distinctly human. The laughter, the sobbing, and the screams sounded really human. My friend and I look at each other. I even begin to laugh a little because the situation was so intense and wild. I had no idea how else to react. I suggested that we bolt for the car, but we agreed to stay since it's a mile away. We just listen to the laughter and screaming until it fades away. Even when it was over, I didn't bother going to bed. 2 years ago, myself and 2 other people were camping in Yellow Bottom, which is in the Cascades of Oregon. At about 3 in the morning, I woke up hearing what sounded like a bunch of people having a campfire party. It was nothing huge, not even scary. It's just people talking and laughing, stuff like that. I was kind of pissed, since we'd specifically come up to get away from the college kids and such, and now somebody had set up camp what sounded like less than 100 yards away. But I couldn't see fire or light through the tent walls. Since fire in the woods was my big concern, I just kind of ground my teeth about it and went back to sleep. About an hour later, I wake up again. This time, somebody has let a little kid start crying, and it's really annoying. It's not wailing, but just sniffles, the kind of prolonged crying that kids do. I listen for about 5 minutes, and since I'm not a monster, I've kind of got this prickly feeling that maybe there's trouble. You know, a little kid is crying all alone. Where the hell are the parents? I started to get up, and my friend, who I thought was sleeping, grabs my arm. I felt like I almost had a heart attack. He whispered seriously that I should not go out. He knows the woods better than me, and he sounded actually scared. So I sit and wait. A few minutes later, the crying stops, and the party starts back up. The weird thing is, I can't really pinpoint now what direction the party is coming from. I was thinking that maybe the group found the kid, and they are now talking again together. But still, I couldn't tell where the sounds were coming from. It's like they were all around us all at once. The party went on for about another hour, just until dawn. Then, all of a sudden, there was nothing. The sounds were gone, like someone was abruptly cut off in the middle of a sentence. I was completely freaked out by then, and I think I might have made a noise when it just stopped like that. My friend, who hadn't even sat up the entire time, just looked at me. He said they were probably stick Indians, and then rolled over and fell back asleep. I got up when the sun was finally completely up and made coffee. I kind of looked around, but I'm not brave like that and didn't go far. But there was nothing. There was no campfire or tents I could see through the trees. We packed up that day, and I asked my friend what a stick Indian was, and he wouldn't tell me. I had to Google it and learned that it's actually a tale from the Northwest Native Americans. I'm not sure if what's online is true or made up, but it's apparently forest spirits that lure people out by making noises like crying babies. So that's my creepy thing in the woods. I've never been back to that campsite again. My husband and I went camping in the 10,000 islands of the Florida Everglades. On the first day, we took our heavily laden kayaks from Chokoloskee to Pavilion Key. We had the entire island to ourselves and set up camp on the beach of the island. We were remote and could only barely see the adjacent islands. To the west was nothing but the wide open Gulf of Mexico. The island is inhabited by a marauding band of raccoons, which will go to great lengths to get your food and water. We buried our food beneath the kayak, and the raccoons still made a valiant effort to get to it. Although our cooler had no food, they did get into it and played with the ice and water. After things settled down, we went to sleep to the sound of gently lapping waves on the beach a few feet from our tent. We were at the top of the tide line, which was evident from a recent storm, so we're not worried about getting wet. Around 2 in the morning, I awoke to an eerie silence. I went out and was regaled by the kind of night sky that takes your breath away. I shone my flashlight out to the water and realized that the reason for the silence was that there was no water. The beach, where we had fished a few hours before, now extended beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. I walked out a ways and still couldn't find the ocean. I can't describe the absolute feeling of remoteness and isolation that I experienced at that moment. I have to admit that I was very freaked out. Trying to calm myself, I went back into the tent. I was fairly sure that it was just the tide, but I couldn't quiet the tiny voice which kept telling me that a huge tsunami was on the way, and that this amazing, beautiful experience would be my last. The return of the lapping waves on the incoming tide made for one of the best sounds I've ever heard. When I was young, my dad lived in an old log cabin about 15 miles west of Sheridan, Wyoming. That's in the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. Every summer when I was visiting, we would go up into the mountains backpacking and fishing for 2 days every weekend. We would park the truck and hike into a remote area. Then we'd go fishing for trout along the way and make camp wherever we ended up. We encountered several strange and creepy things and got into some scary situations with wildlife. But the one that stuck with me the most was an ancient abandoned camp we found. We were hiking down a very steep slope to get to an area of a creek that had been dammed up by beavers, hoping to catch some big trout. I had climbed out on a rock ledge and was looking for a way down. That's when I saw the stock and action of an old rusty rifle sticking out of a tree about 10 feet above the ground. The tree had already grown around the barrel years before. Dad and I climbed down to check it out, and we found a small cave at the base of the rock formation. It's only about 12 feet deep, which would make a nice natural shelter, but a really terrible place to set up a long-term camp. Inside, we found a bunch of really old stuff. There were 3 heavy gauge unopened cans of food, an old cast-iron pot that had holes rusted all the way through, and a crusty old saddle and bridle set. We also saw a very deteriorated heavy wool blanket rolled up and tied with a leather belt. When we unwrapped the blanket, we found several personal items, including a rusty old cap and ball-black powder revolver, a leather satchel with lead pistol shot, a powder horn with no black powder in it, tarnished old cartridges, and a straight razor. The most unsettling was a shirt with holes in it and over half of it stained with dried blood. As we stood there thinking about what all of this meant, it occurred to me how remote this place was even at that time. It was July of 1985, and the fact that whoever owned that shirt had been very seriously injured and stuck on a steep slope in the middle of nowhere got serious chills down my spine. The only thing that somewhat dated this fateful campsite was the pistol and the rifle. Both were made sometime in the 1870s, according to my father. There's no way to ever know what happened to the man who owned all this stuff, but it was unlikely he left that area alive. They, or someone they knew, was obviously shot either by a gun or arrows, and all their belongings were sitting right there about 100 years later. I was once canoeing the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. These aren't your normal backyard ponds. The boundary waters are thousands of enormous lakes interconnected with each other like several mini Great Lakes. We had been canoeing and camping along the lakes for about a week at this point. We didn't really have an itinerary, just planned to boat and camp, fish, and live off the land for 2 weeks. We had a GPS and a satellite phone to call a helicopter for pickup whenever we were done. Anyway, we're about a week in, and we were set to canoe a few hours to the next lake. An hour or so in, and we are in the center of an extremely long and narrow lake. Unfortunately, a storm started to blow in, and the waves on the lake swelled to more than 2 feet. That's too much for our dinky canoes. We pull off to a random clearing on the shore and set up camp quickly to avoid being totally thrashed by a rainstorm. We just set up camp and hunkered down for the night. By the next morning, it had cleared up. We started walking up the coast of the lake about 200 feet from our camp looking for a good fishing spot. What we actually found was another campsite. However, it was absolutely wrecked. There was trash strewn everywhere, the tent was collapsed and torn, and there were clothes on the ground. At first, we were just disgusted at the undisciplined people who did this. Why leave their stuff out to be bear food? The more we looked around, though, the weirder things seemed to be. For one, their garbage was still hoisted into a tree to keep it safe from bears. However, the whole bag was ripped open despite being 30 feet in the air. Second, literally, everything except the canoes were still at the campsite. There were clothes, packs, food, rope, pans, and a serious set of hiking equipment for 2 to 3 people. Half of it was trashed and torn open. The other half was totally untouched but thrown on the ground. It's like somebody quickly escaped the hell out of there, in nothing but their long johns, ditching hundreds of dollars of gear in the process. We waited a couple of hours and eventually called it back to our helicopter crew. They hadn't been aware of anybody else or gotten any distress calls. We eventually just left everything and moved camp. Everybody was pretty upset by it, and a day or 2 later we ended the whole trip early because it seemed like nobody wanted to be out anymore. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. First, I thought it was bear attack, but there was food left uneaten, and I've seen bear attacks on camps before. Bears rip open packs and go after food, and are generally pretty easy to scare away. What still sticks with me is why all their clothes and packs were still there. Half was totally destroyed, and the other half was untouched. I still don't get it. Your support means a lot to me. Please drop a like and subscribe to Eerie Echoes for more horror stories. As always, thank you for watching.